Well, everybody, how you doing? There are a couple of things which we can learn from the kingship of Solomon. One is that discernment is the primary goal of any leader. The other is one should continue staying on that very course of verifying that you are following God's will and not being distracted. Now, should you begin following your own ideas, straying away from God, the people will be affected, and they start beginning to follow you and doing their own ways. So you are leading regardless. Now, last week we saw Solomon consolidate power. There was little forgiveness or care in his executing his enemies. But, on the other hand, he had not asked for wisdom as of yet. When we are reading about King Solomon, we have to get a few things right in our mind. First is idolatry. Many people have the warped idea of what idolatry is. We think of strictly pagan Roman or Greek gods, maybe some other things like that. But idolatry takes some other power and places it above the true God. Now we've got to remember, he says he is the true God and that we are made in his image and likeness. But there is one God that quite a number of people have above the true God Almighty, and that is the worship of ourselves and God being made into our image and likeness. See, it may be the source of all sin, pride. So let's take a look at how Solomon allowed for other gods to get in his way, affecting millions in the kingdom. And then let us look directly at ourselves and see what we have defined. Now, in a moment of hubris, I do ask to subscribe to our channel, to hit that bell for YouTube or follow us on Facebook. That way you won't miss a new video or commentary we upload. We will be back after our introduction to begin our look at Solomon's kingship. Well, a few minutes ago, I spoke of idolatry, and its most noticeable case is the worship of our own ideas and calling, as opposed to God's. Now, one might hear, this is how I think God should handle the situation or that situation. Maybe more, God can't possibly want me to have children or to give up my job at work in a missionary field. So let's see how good or bad Solomon's reign goes. Now, Solomon's first act, if one is paying close attention, one will notice that it gives us a foreshadowing of where things are going. Notice his first act was to align himself with Egypt by marrying the Pharaoh's daughter. Now, this leads directly to an issue. If we look back to Torah, those are the first 5 books of the Bible, and we look to that 5th book called Deuteronomy, we look to chapter 7, 3, and 4, we find an interesting passage. It says, "You shall not intermarry with them, neither giving their daughters to their sons, nor taking their daughters for your sons. For they would turn your sons from following me to serving other gods. And when the anger of the Lord would flare up against you, he would quickly destroy you." Now, who are these people that they should not marry? Well, that is given in verse 1. People that are specifically mentioned were a list of people that Israel would have to defeat in order to conquer Canaan. But along with that would be those of Egypt, since the goal would be you just left Egypt, get out of there, and not to allow them to marry those worshiping other gods. That, of course, would include the Egyptians. So over the years, unfortunately, many have used these lines to mean other races should not marry. Caucasians and Africans should not marry, Polish and Chinese, or any other combination under the sun, but that is completely usurping what that verse means. Now, I've talked in the past of cherry picking from the Bible. This has nothing to do with people of various countries. The point is really not anything about marriage, but marrying someone who will take you away from your roots. See, God has established the first of the commandments to have his Israeli people recognize that there is one God. There should be no other gods before him, and to honor him on the Sabbath. That is God's calling to us. Now, if you're brought closer to God and his commands, then it's a great thing. Things that are pulling you away from that relationship with God, not a good thing. Now, one could think immediately that God was trying to separate peoples. And guess what? He was. He was using Israel to show the world who he was and the one true God, who is to be worshipped on the Sabbath, and there is no reason to have any other gods before him. So this is what made Israel stand out from the remaining world. And it worked. People all recognized that Israel was different and that the great deeds that were being done were by God. But instead of Israel standing up and saying, well, the reality is it is God who is doing all these miraculous deeds, we follow his prescriptions and God allows us to flourish. No, but that is not, unfortunately, many times what Israel said. Israel said many times, yeah, we're cool. We beat you. You need to serve us, and we'll obey our own rules and prescriptions. And man, we are great. Solomon followed his own prescriptions by marrying the daughter of Pharaoh for one reason: to have a powerful ally that no one would mess with. He didn't accede to God's will or ways, but instead made a show of consolidating his power and then married Pharaoh's daughter. Oh, and then he decided he better be good to God and make his temple. See, God had allowed that Solomon should make the temple in his promise to King David, and out of deference to his promise, he allowed Solomon to request wisdom, and God gave him, as Solomon asked, and he also gave him wealth beyond anything anyone had ever saw. Solomon's reign was full of wisdom and full of reverence for God at first. Perhaps this is because of his youth. Solomon listened to the wise words of his father from chapter 2. Let me get that for you. It says, keep the mandate of the Lord your God, following his ways and observing his statutes, commands, ordinances, and decrees as they were written in the law of Moses, that you may succeed in whatever you do whenever you turn. And the Lord may fulfill the promise he made on my behalf when he said, if your son so conducts themselves that they remain faithful to me with their whole heart and with their whole soul, you shall always have someone in your line on the throne of Israel. So for God, he gave this warning again in chapter 3, right after he gave Solomon wisdom to rule the kingdoms. See, in chapter 3, verse 14, he said to Solomon for the first time, this is from God directly, if you walk in my ways, keep my statutes and commandments, as David your father did, I will give you a long life. So then, the most famous of Solomon's judgments occurred. The decision to cut the child in half, to give both women arguing over whose child it was. The true mother, of course, gave up her son to save him, and all sat in wonder and awe. Now, I actually urge you to read the account there. There's so many fascinating details I had forgotten, and you're going to bring this story much more fully than anything I remembered. So, got the down at the bottom here, the verse numbers. So the next part of 1 Kings, well, I have to say, even by my standards, are honestly quite boring. Not because there's not grandeur and beauty being built, but it's not someone living in the 21st century's beauty. and the exactness, the finesse of the woodworkers, the fine stonework. It talks of things not known in today's world. And not the things that we can understand individually as beautiful. But the end result, the picture that might give us a quick glance at the completed temple, it's awe-inspiring. It's fantastic. It's amazing. And honestly, it's so sad that its final lifespan would only be a couple hundred years. But along with this came perhaps the most beautiful, the prayer of Solomon in chapter 8. It's a long prayer covering so many things in so many ways. But after that prayer, God comes to Solomon a second time and promised the prayer was accepted and that God had consecrated the temple. But again, God offered a warning to Solomon. This one a bit stronger and a bit more encompassing. God was seeing something, and while allowing Solomon his freedom, was giving him the straight facts. See, David said in chapter 9, which I'll get to here, and this is verses 4 through 9. So it's a little bit of a longer one, but as for you, if you live in my presence as your father David lived, sincerely and uprightly, doing just as I have commanded you, keeping my statutes and decrees, I will establish your throne of sovereignty over Israel forever, as I promised your father David when I said, you shall always have someone from your line on the throne in Israel. But if you and your descendants ever withdraw from me, fail to keep the commandments and the statutes which I set before you, and proceed to venerate and worship strange gods, I will cut off Israel from the land I gave them, and repudiate the temple I have consecrated to my honor. Israel shall become a proverb and a byword among all nations, and this temple shall become a heap of ruins. Every passer-by shall catch his breath in amazement and ask, why has the Lord done this to the land and to his temple? Men will answer, they forsook the Lord, their God, who brought their fathers out of the land of Egypt. They adopted strange gods, which they worshipped and served. That is why the Lord has brought down upon them all this evil. So David gave him advice. God gave him 2 warnings. 3 strikes, you're out. See, I've never had a one-on-one talk with God, but I imagine it's pretty straightforward. He talks, you listen, and you understand fully what he expects. Solomon appeared to have everything: money, palaces, riches. It appears that in his building and various projects, he even made a tree become extinct. See, in chapter 10, verse 11, it talks about cabinet wood. But by verse 12, it says, no more such wood was bought or seen to the present day. We have no idea what this wood is. Now, the Queen of Sheba, she's most likely from Yemen and was amazed by the riches, the intellect, and was given everything that was asked of Solomon. And she returned home totally amazed at what she witnessed. It speaks of the wealth of Solomon, but those warnings by his father and God would not be heeded. The amount of labor, supplies, and of course taxes was humongous. The call for more and more money became quite an issue. As Solomon got older, he began to not keep the Lord at the center of his heart. He built temples to other gods for his wives, who continued their worship of false gods. He worshipped the gods of the Sidonites, the Ammonites, the Moabites, the Edomites, the Hittites, which, as we mentioned a bit earlier, And the cards began to tumble down for Israel. Old enemies began to increase in power. We were introduced to a man named Jeroboam. The people of the northern section received little benefit from all the taxes being paid, and rifts began to show along with the enemies beginning to be bothersome again. Solomon himself would be able to hold the kingdom together. His son, Rehoboam, would not. The punishment of not fearing and honoring God's commands are rife. But as the king goes, so does its people. God said to have no other gods before me. They did. 10 tribes went to Jeroboam, 2 to Rehoboam, Solomon's son. When Israel split over the running of the kingdom, 10 tribes would go with Jeroboam. The last 2 would stay with Solomon's son, but he would be named as Solomon's successor. The divided kingdom would begin. Solomon's riches, wisdom, and power would be destroyed because he did not follow the ways of God. How many times did he have to hear it? We must remember that the ways of foreign gods may seem alluring. Today we hear of increases in Wiccan, various pagan religions coming to the forefront, smaller and smaller amounts of people going to Christian churches in general. The lessons that are being taught in the book of Samuel and Kings are not being heard or listened to. There is nothing boring about any of these stories. We simply do not want to listen. It's easier to do things our own way and not listen to God. Only 25% of people are going to Mass on Sunday believe in the true presence of Jesus. That is the people that actually go. It seems that only 25% of Catholics even go to Mass on any given week. So I know the people watching this know the reality of things, but we have to do more as a church to make our beliefs known and honestly given to everyone. We foolishly buried our heads in the sand for far too long now. We were lulled into looking into our feelings, and all that we had to do was to participate, wave a banner or two, act as an usher. No. We were supposed to learn. By learning, we pass on that information. We have all the opportunities to learn from so many sources. Our sons and daughters deserve that. Most part, we failed them. Our pastors didn't say. We didn't say. See, we had this idea everything would be fine. We just did nothing. How did this work out for David? He did nothing to teach or correct his kids. Did his children stay in good graces? Did Absalom, after being made upset by doing nothing about his son? Did Adonijah, by assuming the kingship, was anything done for him? Did Solomon listen to the wise words of his father? We have so much to learn from the presentations in scriptures. And slowly, but surely, the United States, after standing up for democracy throughout the world, fell asleep after the fall of the USSR. God was at the center of our attention when we fought World War I and II, but we became top dog. Everyone looked to us. We, like Israel, could have shown the world the light of Christ. How well are we doing at this? Are we instead looking inward and following our feelings, our passions? We pay more attention to feelings and our likes than we do to the reality that God and His commands give us. We no longer lead the world because we forgot about God. Just like the wisdom of Solomon. He turned his attention to other gods just as we did. Big oil, big pharma, stock market increases, cash, clothing, cars. God gave all this to Solomon, but Solomon learned the hard way not to worship the amazing sum of riches he received. We didn't learn that lesson yet. We gave up kids, not to look forward and make the world greater, but to keep a hold of more money, clothes, vacations. When in honor, we put honor to our own gods. We began using birth control, or if that failed us, that made it easy to go down the street and murder our own child. We learned the problems associated with doing these things, reading through Samuel and Kings, but we stopped listening. It's too hard to associate with this stuff. It was too long ago. Over the past 6 weeks, we found out no, it's not 3,000 years ago, but out there in our own front porches, and our front pages of the newspaper, the lead story on our news, all of the murders, the hatred, the strife, all because we lost our thinking about, much less loving God. So, what does the Bible teach? How to live and to live right. How to love those who hate us. We're to give away our tunic, to allow others to treat us wrongly so that you can treat them rightly. It isn't that hard. It just isn't that hard. I'm here to remind you, it is not that hard to love your neighbor. Treat them with respect. God loves you more than you can ever imagine, and He loves them too. Would it not be good to go over the lessons learned over the past 7,000 years, and instead of making the same mistakes time after time after time, break with the world of our self-centeredness and move toward love, the love taught to us by Jesus Christ? Next week, we're going to turn to the first letter of Peter, and then we have reached that time of reflection. We can head to Ash Wednesday and Lent. We again work ourselves forward, rebuilding ourselves and loving ourselves and loving God. So see you next week. God bless. Bye.